Okay, we're continuing this week to look at the book of Genesis as we're doing our survey through the whole Old Testament. We've got up, I believe, to about Genesis 30. We're going to start out talking about Jacob's wives and sons and just the whole mess with Jacob. Now, there is a question, a group study sheet that I have to go along with this with some questions on it, and we'll ask those questions as we go through. Of course, that is optional. That I'm teaching through my Old Testament survey class, and this is one of the things that I do with my students. So that's, if you want to use that, that's available. So talking about Jacob's wives and all the implications of that as we work through Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 30, verse 1. Now when Rachel, and if you remember a little bit of the background, Rachel was beautiful. Jacob fell in love with Rachel and asked for her hand in marriage. And her dad said, well, you're going to have to work 7 years. So he did. And then on the wedding night, he went in to be with Rachel, and the next morning he woke up and it was Leah, her sister. And so Laban, his father-in-law, pulled a trick on Jacob. Now Jacob was a deceiver, and I think in the way this story was originally told, the hearer of the story is supposed to say, well, that's a little bit of comeuppance. Jacob had been a trickster and a deceiver, and now the table's been turned on him. Now, let me just step back and say, and I'll say this probably again several times as we go through this, in my opinion, sizing up this story, Leah was meant by God to be Jacob's wife. And when the switcheroo was made and when he had consummated his marriage with Leah, I believe it was God's will that Jacob be done with wives. Now that's reading somewhat into the story. That's not the way these ancient stories were told, but that is certainly my opinion based on the rest of the Bible, that Leah was supposed to be the wife. And my evidence, and again, we'll go back over this as we go through. First, Leah has 7 children that are named. And 7 is the number for completion. Something is, we say perfect, but that just means finished. Is as it should be. That's all it should be. When you have 7 kids, that means you've had the number of kids that you were supposed to have. It's a symbolic number. In addition, the blessing goes, and so the whole key, in my opinion, again, to understanding the book of Genesis is tracking from Genesis 3:15, when God is giving consequences for sin, and he says to the woman, your seed, there'll be enmity between your seed and the seed of the serpent. We begin tracking that seed. And that's called the line of promise, the line of descendancy, lots of different names, the kingly line, because, prophecy says a king will be born for Israel from that line of the woman. Well, that line goes through Leah and not through Rachel. Rachel was the wife that Jacob wanted, but the line of descendancy, God's plan, and that line of descendancy leads right down to the cross in Jesus. The line of the descendancy goes through Judah. And for those reasons, I really think that Leah was the intended, God's will for Jacob. But the story of Jacob is about Jacob's will. Jacob is stubborn and determined, and he fights to get what he wants. So he makes a deal with his father-in-law Laban. He says, what'd you do? I didn't want Leah, I wanted Rachel. He said, I'll tell you what, Jacob, you work 7 more years and I'll give you Rachel too. Now, in the story, I noticed a year or two ago in this story that he goes ahead and moves, rather than working 7 years and being married to Leah for 7 years and then getting Rachel as a second wife, he moves Rachel right on in his tent right away. And so Jacob, very willful. And now Jacob is living like a patriarch in that world. In the ancient time, a wealthy man, a landowner, had multiple wives. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, if the Bible's saying that's okay or not. But he does like a Canaanite landowner would do and has multiple wives. So the Bible very often, how do I want to say it? The Bible, in the way that they tell the story, and this is a technique for telling a story, and we've talked about this all the time in the Old Testament, these Old Testament storytelling lessons, they don't tell you this is the moral of this story. What they do is they paint a picture, a story, a word picture, and then you look and see how the story turns out, and then you decide for yourself as a hearer of the story if what Jacob does is good or bad. Okay? Now that's different. We modern people, we like to get down to the end of the story and it says, hey, here's what you're supposed to learn from this story. A, it's bad to have more than one wife. B, that's going to lead to a lot of trouble. C, that's what we like, but that's not what you're going to get here. And so I want you to pay attention and hear the story, let it wash over you, sink in, and you tell me if the author is painting a good picture of polygamy or a bad picture of polygamy. Now, polygamy is having multiple wives. Okay, that was the culture of the land, but is the biblical author in favor of it or against it? That's kind of the question we're trying to get at here. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, that's Leah. Okay, the wife that was snuck up, Jacob was deceived and given Leah. And he consummated the marriage before he realized that it was Leah. And she said to Jacob, give me children or else I'll die. We know Jacob was like, I'm doing my best, I'm doing my part. And so Jacob got mad, and Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel. And he said, am I in the place of God? They very much, in the ancient world, believed that the gods participated in every aspect of our life, in the polytheistic culture. And likewise, they believed when a woman did not get pregnant, God was at work in that situation. And that's why over and over we see women, including Rachel, before we saw Sarai, we're going to see Hannah, just lots of stories of barren women. They very much believe that when God wills that person to get pregnant, that is when they get pregnant. We can do all the dances we want to do, but if it is not God's will for someone to get pregnant, they don't get pregnant. Now go back to Genesis 2:7. God formed man from the dust of the ground, just like he formed everything else from the cosmic dust, and he breathed his breath into him and he became a living being. That all life is created by God. And it is a part of God's purpose and plan. So Jacob gets mad. I've been doing my part. Am I in the place of God? God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb. God has kept you from getting pregnant. Verse 3, so she said, here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees. So in other words, it will be as if I gave you a child, that I also may have children by her. And this was a strange thing for Bible studying people for the longest time. Sometime, I believe, in the late 1800s, but it might have been the early 1900s, in Mesopotamia, there is a town called Mari. I believe it is at Mari. They found tablets. So there had been an invasion while they were cooking tablets with the law codes on them. And they just left the furnace, ran from the furnace that was drying out these tablets, and they ran for their life, or they fought, or whatever, and the tablets were forgotten about. So 1,000, 2,000 years later, they dug up the city of Mari on the Euphrates River, and they found this oven, and in it they found these tablets, and they'd been preserved because they'd been buried in the oven. They had never been pulled out. And they found on the Mari tablets law codes for Mesopotamia. It was a wealthy family's house they found this in, and they were making their own records of the law codes. Maybe the person that owned the house was some kind of lawyer, we don't know. But anyway, in the Mari tablets in Mesopotamia, they believed if the mistress of the house, the lady of the house, was barren, then the father of the house, the master, could impregnate one of her handmaids, one of her servants, and in the eyes of the law, that was a legal heir. Okay? So we see cases, but Sarai did the exact same thing. Sarai was Mesopotamian. She got Hagar and gave Hagar to Abraham. That what they believed is God was not answering their prayer fast enough, so they turned to the law of the land for a solution. Now, God had promised Sarai that she was going to have a baby. And so it is a lack of faith for her to turn to the law code to fix her solution. Now, most of us, we don't have special revelation where God speaks with an audible voice. And so I'm not condemning, people taking steps to get things done, to get pregnant and so forth, and getting medical attention for that. I'm not condemning that at all. And I don't think the Bible necessarily is. But ultimately, we all have a faith problem. And when God does not answer our prayer fast enough, most people will turn to some other way to fix a thing. And we get at some point to where we will say a prayer, and if it's not answered immediately, we take matters into our own hands. And we quit believing that God is really God. And so I think that's what it's getting at. Anyway, giving her handmaid to her husband is Mesopotamian law. And here they are in Mesopotamia, up north in Haran. And so they are doing a rather normal thing in their pagan, polytheistic culture. Then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as a wife, and Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. So Leah has had several sons. Rachel, the favored wife, has given her young handmaid, and now Jacob has a son by Bilhah. Then Rachel said, God has judged my case, and he has heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore, she called his name Dan. Dan just means to judge or judgment. Daniel is my God is judge or judgment of God. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again, bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister Leah, and indeed I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. So far, what is the general mood of this story? Well, what do you think about this? Is it kind of fun? Is it a funny story? What is the household of Jacob like?
One up each other.
It is a very competitive, we might say cutthroat. Is cutthroat good? Is that a good environment to bring children up in that highly competitive cutthroat? No, it's not. And let's look at Jacob a minute. What's Jacob doing? He's going along with it. Jacob is not, and it's very important, and this is a characteristic. Jacob is very willful about what Jacob wants. When Jacob wants something, he is tenacious. But does it seem that Jacob wants harmony in his house? Does it seem that he wants godliness in his house? Not mentioned, is it? Go with my handmaid. Does Jacob say, honey, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. That's going to cause trouble. No. And so again, just like in the story of Adam and Eve, the man is passive. And he goes along. Does he know that it's wrong? It's speculation. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible, but I believe he does. I think he's taking advantage of a situation. I think Jacob is sinning. And for me, as a man, I take the most offense at Jacob. I think this is all Jacob's fault. Then Leah saw she had stopped bearing. Well, probably because Jacob was occupied in the other tent. I don't know. So she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. So did Leah take the high ground? No. That's part of the story. There's not a good guy so far that I've seen. There's nobody that's saying, stop, let's inquire of the Lord. Let's pray about this. Let's take a step back. Whoa. Let's step back. And gave her to Jacob as a wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, a troop comes. And so Gad is similar to the name troop of soldiers. So she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, I am happy, for daughters will call me blessed. So she named his name Asher. Asher is to be blessed or to be wealthy is the name Asher. It's very similar to that verb. So is this passage condoning multiple wives?
Sounds like to me it's pretty good reason, pretty good reasons not to.
Okay, and that is correct. That is what storytelling is trying to do, but it's a lost art among modern people. You know, have you watched a movie lately? Explosion, shooting, screaming cuss words, and some nudity. That's in the story kind of strings those things together. It's not about the story, it's about boom boom, and stimulation and excitement. We've lost the art of telling a story, and I very much believe the Bible is an ancient document written in ancient time, originally told as stories. And the storyteller is trying to teach lessons. And we're supposed to look at this situation and saying, is this God-pleasing? Does this honor God? Is it furthering God's will to take on other wives? Jacob's sons, a lot of them are knuckleheads and they do awful things. It's no wonder. It's no wonder. And so I say emphatically that this passage is doing the opposite. It is recognizing that the society that Jacob is doing something normal for people that don't love God, that don't love Yahweh. That's normal for a patriarch to have multiple wives. So he's doing what society does, not doing what pleases God. It's just done in a style that we're not familiar with. And so anybody that says that the Bible condones polygamy, I disagree. I think I can see why they would say that, because Jacob is a major character and he's engaging in polygamy. But I think that it very much is telling us this is a bad idea and this displeases God. So just give a quick description of Jacob's household.
Imagine.
Can you imagine? I mean, even for a minute, you know, we have awful situations that we see around us in society, and I tell you, probably one of the number one problems in America today, in my opinion, is that men don't stay at home and be daddy. And kids grow up raising themselves, raised on the internet and raised by other kids. They learn right and wrong rather than from a daddy that gets up and goes to work and takes care of the family. And he does it to take care of the family, and he teaches his family right and wrong. And he says, hey, team, we need to honor God in the way we go about this life. Moms are scrambling just to hold everything together, and the kids are raising themselves. And so I think this is a classic example. Rather than condoning polygamy, it is a classic example, ancient example of what's wrong in our society. One of the big things that's wrong in our society today. Turn on the news, just about any problem, I think, can relate back to men failing to raise their families well. That's my opinion. And I think I say a train wreck of a household. And anybody that could think this is painting a positive picture of polygamy, I disagree. Now Reuben, the oldest son, his name is Ra-Ben. Anything with Ben in it, Ben is son in Hebrew. And Ru is the word for see, to Ra, to see. And so when Reuben was born, the first son, they go, look, we have a son, Reuben. Now Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest, and he found mandrakes in the field. Now this is just a little side thing. We no longer believe that mandrakes help women get pregnant. But this was a cultural, again, in ancient times, they thought that mandrakes might help. And this is just a little side part of the story. Again, the Bible is not saying mandrakes cause pregnancy. I do not think. This is part of the storytelling thing. He found mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But Leah said back to Rachel, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, therefore, if you give me those mandrakes, Jacob will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, hey, guess what? You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. And if that ain't a picture of love, I don't know what is, right? And Jacob lay with Leah that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband. I don't agree with Leah. And I don't think that the Bible is telling us that God rewarded Leah because she had her husband commit adultery with her handmaid. But we are in a story world here. And it's one of the interesting things about studying the Bible and reading the Bible. As we watch this story unfold, we have sort of a God's eye view of things, and we can see things and we know things that the characters in the story do not know. And that's true of all literature. As you read a fictional book, you are standing above the literary fictional world that's being represented in the book. And it's the same thing true of the Bible. And so I want to be careful. I don't want to say that the Bible is a story and that it's not true. I'm just saying we have insight to things that the characters in the story might not understand fully, and we can understand things. Anyway, I am saying that she is wrong, that God is doing this because her husband committed adultery with her handmaid. As I've said, in my opinion, everybody except that Jacob sleeps with, except Leah, he is committing adultery, including Rachel. That's my opinion on the story. And again, the story does not give us those details and does not say those things explicitly. So that's another reason it's very unsatisfying these stories are to modern people. They want things laid out explicitly. But storytelling is intended for you to put yourself in the story and think about what is right and what is wrong. And we are to learn from the examples of others. Then Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob's sixth son. Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him six sons. Is that true? Does Jacob begin to favor? So again, like I say, Leah doesn't know what she's talking about. We know, but she doesn't. So she called his name Zebulon. That is similar to these concepts, good endowment and all that. It's a pitiful story, isn't it? And afterwards, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. That is the seventh child. And so it is true, if you will, that God did bless Leah. Leah, nobody else had more than two children. Leah had more children that is named than the other three women combined. And so if you want to pick a blessing out, it is true that God blessed Leah, and I would say because Leah was the intended wife. But that is me going a little bit beyond, that is me adding an interpretation to what the text actually says. So everybody be mindful of that. And there's nothing wrong with it. We're supposed to interpret Scripture. It's just some people sometimes interpret and they make that part of the Scripture. And so you always got to be wary. Read what the text says and interpret what it says. Then God remembered Rachel, who so far has not had kids. There have been a lot of babies had. I believe 11 children have been born so far, named children. And finally, Rachel has a child. God listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph. Joseph is the name, is similar to the word Yasaf, to add. So he has added a son to me is what Joseph means. But it's got double meaning because Joseph is an administrator, one who keeps numbers, one who adds. And so his name basically would be something like adder, person who adds. The Lord shall add to me another son. Now, let me ask you, does this story, and I've already touched on it a little bit, does this story relate to Genesis 16 and Hagar? And the answer is yes. Let's go through a little bit of this story with Hagar, jumping back to Genesis 16. Now, Sarai, and if you remember, Sar is a leader. You might say a captain in Hebrew. And then the AI is a possessive on the end, a feminine possession. And so basically, Abraham called his wife my leader woman, and we say a woman that is a leader is a princess. So he called her my princess, which is kind of a sweet name. My princess is what Sarai means. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. That same thing. God was closing her womb. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abraham, see now, Yahweh has restrained me from bearing children. So she is indicting God. Go in to my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Abraham heeded the voice of Sarai. What are the similarities between the two stories?
They're parallel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the women are taking matters into their own hand, and when God does not give them what they want, they seek another solution, a sinful solution, to get what they want. Now, does that, when they do the sinful solution, does that fix the problem? Are the women satisfied in these stories with the outcomes? They are not. If anything, it exacerbates the difficulty. Now, does this relate back? Do these two stories relate back any further in Genesis?
Well, it's like you said about the men have stood by and let the women do whatever they said, and then they've gone home with it.
Yeah, all the way back to Adam and Eve, doesn't it? And in case you missed that, and we might miss it as English speakers, look at this line. Then Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her handmaid. The verb there is lakak. It is the exact verb and the exact form of the verb that it said, and the woman, Eve, took the apple. She took her handmaid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband. That is a line straight. It's the exact same line that was in Genesis 1:6. She took the fruit and she ate, and she gave to her husband. And so we're supposed to see the parallel that Sarai here is doing the exact same thing as Eve was doing. And then Abraham is doing the exact same thing that Adam did. Now, interestingly, the same line we've read it, happened in the story in Genesis 30. Which wife do you think it used the same verb form, just basically the same line? You take out fruit and you take out Adam and you put in her handmaid Zilpah and Jacob in, and it's the same sentence. Which wife do you think it is in the story in Genesis 30 with Jacob? And your choices are Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, Zilpah. It's Leah. Again, that's another bit of evidence that God meant for Leah to be the only wife. She does the same sin as the legitimate wife Eve and the legitimate wife here Sarai. The Rachel did not use the same line that Rachel lost faith and gave her handmaid. It uses a different verb form. What's the implication? Leah was supposed to be the wife. So Abraham, whatever you say, babe, went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, when Sarai saw that Hagar had conceived, her mistress Sarai became despised in her eyes. So she got nasty. She felt like she had given birth to the son. She ought to be the first wife. And so that is it is a directly parallel story, and it is a matter of faith. It is a faith problem. Now we proceed from Genesis 30 to Genesis 34. Remember Dinah. Dinah was the daughter born to Leah. We pick up the story sometime later with Dinah. Now, I think one of the important things about this story and how to interpret. This is a very difficult story to interpret. We're going to read through the whole thing, and it's a gruesome story. So everybody think pleasant thoughts and strap your seat belts. Put on your steel-toed boots. These are This is a difficult story. But we can do it. We can do it. So Dinah is the legitimate daughter of the legitimate wife, Leah. However, Leah is treated like a redheaded stepchild. So Leah, I believe, was God's intended wife, but she is not given her credit. And so the camera is focusing here on the children of Leah. None of the other children are mentioned. And other than this brief mention of Leah, the 4 wives are not mentioned of Jacob. The 4 wives. The only female, the only Hebrew female mentioned is Dinah. And I think that's very significant in interpreting this story, what's going on. So they have all that in chapter 30 that we just looked at happened up in Mesopotamia, in Haran. They have come down into the promised land now, and they're going through the promised land. Now they are surrounded by Canaanites. They are a minority. They are endangered if they've got to keep their nose clean around the Canaanites, or else they could get in serious trouble here. And so they're walking a thin line is kind of the backdrop of this story. They're going from city to city, trying to figure out what they're going to do in the promised land. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. Okay? So she is out not with Hebrew girls. She has left the family, and she has gone out to interact with non-Israelites. Now, I think one of the important steps in interpreting the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, is to understand, to me, the best way. We don't know exactly when they were written. We don't know exactly by whom they were written. Tradition has always said that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, we know that he probably did not write all of Deuteronomy, because it says, and Moses was no more, and it's doubtful that he wrote that, and what came after that. But, and he did not sign it and say, I, Moses, am writing this. Tradition says that Moses wrote this, and Jesus did not say Moses wrote the whole Old Testament, but he said what Moses wrote. And so definitely Moses is involved in the writing. To me, the best way to understand this, just the clearest and most systematic way to understand the writing of the Pentateuch, is that major portions of the tradition were put down by Moses during the 40 years of wandering. Because they would go, they were not walking every day. They would go and find a water source, and they would stay at that water source at an oasis as long as they had water and were able to get food there. They were able to water their livestock and have enough to eat. And when that began to get scarce, they'd move on to the next place. So they may have camped in one place. They could have stayed several years in one place if it was a good enough water source. What did they do? What did Moses do during that time? He sat in his tent and he wrote the Bible. And so as they went through the wilderness, they were a great group of people, and they would stress wherever they went, for supplies. But they stayed in a group because there were marauders and brigands and crooks that followed them looking for bits and pieces of what they had. And so in order to stay safe with this danger all around them, they needed to stay in the group. So people did not camp out away from the group of the Israelites. Because if you did that, the bad guys would sweep through and kill you and take your stuff. They would kill the men, they would take the women of childbearing age and the children as slaves, and they would keep all your stuff. And so that affects the way these stories are molded, a lot of them. For example, in Genesis, when we looked at it the last week or the week before, where it said, in the day that you eat of the tree that is in the middle, dying you shall die. And we know that that was not true, that they dropped dead all of a sudden. What that meant was, in the context of when the Bible was written, in the day that you rebel against me and are disobedient, you will be cast out of the family of God, those that live with God. And so you'll still be alive, but you'll be out here. What does that mean, to be out of the family and the safety of the family? That means that you have endangered yourself and that you might be gobbled up and killed very quickly. In the day that you disobey me as God, you will be cast out of the family of God to fend for yourself in this world. You will be lost to the family of God, right? Same thing here. A daughter is vulnerable. If you don't believe me, come to my house one night when Ellie is out after dark. I begin getting agitated because I cannot look out for her. And the world gets less safe, especially for females, after dark. And so she has left the group, the safety of the family, and she is out visiting the daughter of land. So she has made herself exposed and vulnerable. Does anything happen to her because of that? Oh, yes. The worst that you can imagine, almost the worst that you can imagine, happens to her. And whose fault is it?
Jacob's.
Jacob has some responsibility, but this expression, to see the daughters of the land, shows some intention on Dinah's part. Do you think she went to her dad and said, Dad, could I leave the family and go hang out with Canaanite girls? There also, this phrase has been examined by people, and it may be a euphemism for prostitution in the Bible. There's a couple places where similar phrases come up, and it is a euphemism for prostitution. I don't think it is here. I think it is a euphemism for she has made a bad choice. And she has made herself vulnerable. She has exposed herself to danger. And that is on Dinah. Jacob is my ultimate bad guy. You know I've got a thing for kicking Jacob, right? And so yes, Jacob, but you cannot control your daughter's every move. You can only do your best. And so that's important. Dinah has put herself at risk. And when Shechem, the city is named Shechem. Shechem is a word for shoulder because it's on the shoulder of Mount Ebal. And so he is named after the city. So when Shechem, the son of Hamor, Hamor means mule or donkey, Hamor is the king, and he is a Hivite. Shechem is the prince of the country. Hamor is the king of the city of Shechem. When Shechem saw her, he took her and lay with her, and he violated her. Some versions say he raped her. And so I'll ask the question, some people, modern people, analyze this story and they say there's indications that it was consensual on Dinah's part. That Dinah went on a date and decided to sleep with Shechem. And I guess I hope so. It's much better than being raped, certainly. But in the eyes of God, both things are sinful. Shechem is certainly guilty no matter which it is. And if he raped Dinah, she's not guilty for being raped, but her guilt is she is responsible for going out to visit the daughters of the land. She has made herself vulnerable. She has made a bad choice. Now, that does not mean she is I'm not saying she is responsible for being raped. I'm saying she made a sinful choice and put herself in a bad situation. And both are sinful. Now, Shechem, his soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. Now, and that is the evidence that people use that this was a consensual relationship. Because in general, men don't fall in love with women that they rape. I don't think they ever do. And so it's likely that it was consensual. But I say again, in the eyes of the biblical author, it doesn't matter. They are not married before God, and so their sexual behavior is sinful. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this young woman as a wife." Now notice, Dinah is not released to go back to her father and await the decision about her marriage. She is kept in Shechem's household, ostensibly. I'm not 100% on that, but the story, apparently she is kept. We say prisoner, maybe she chose to be there. She was not returned. A little background, Hamor means, as I said, donkey. And donkey has always been a symbol of ignorance, but it is also a symbol for making a deal in the ancient world. And so Hamor, that name may mean fool, maybe symbol of a fool, but it also may be symbolic of a deal maker, a wheeler dealer. And that's in the background too of this story. And Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled Dinah, his daughter, defiled because whether it is consensual or not, it is sinful to sleep with a woman that you're not married to. Now, Jacob's sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. I think that phrase is not meant to tell us that Jacob is a calm person. I think that, again, is that same thing. Jacob is passive. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak to him. So to go and negotiate for Dinah's hand for his son Shechem. It is very interesting. John Calvin, in his commentary on Genesis, said kind of made Shechem, the prince Shechem, a hero. And said, yes, he did bad with Dinah, but then he repents and he is trying to fix things. And John Calvin calls him noble, a noble young man. And he said, I wish these young men in the seminary, in John Calvin's seminary, were as noble as Shechem. I just find that interesting. It gives me a reason to not like Calvin. By contrast, Martin Luther, who was roughly contemporary with Calvin, he had a 12-year-old daughter at the time he wrote his commentary on Genesis. What do you think he thought of Shechem? He said there is a special pit in hell for Prince Shechem for what he did. And I just find that kind of funny, kind of funny. Verse 7, the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved and very angry, because Shechem had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. So it is sinful. Doesn't matter. Consent does not matter here. Maybe, and it sounds likely, it doesn't matter. They did not get married before God and before the congregation, and they did not have their marriage blessed by God then and only then. But notice again, in storytelling technique, we have to think about those things for ourselves. The clues are there that it is wrong, but it doesn't say that it was wrong whether or not it was consensual. And what would our modern people say about the daughter going out? Now, modern people are not in favor of rape. Nobody is, certainly. But generally, secular thought, if she went out on a date and they kind of fell for one another and slept together, what does society say?
It's okay.
It's a beautiful love story, isn't it? And it's not. It's sin. Very important. But Hamor spoke with them, the sons and Jacob. The soul of my son longs for your daughter. He is smitten with her. Please give her to him as a wife. And make marriages with us. Become one people with us. Take your heritage from Abraham, descendants of Abraham, and mix it with the people of the land, the Canaanites. Let's just become one people. Let's lose all identity, individual identity here. Take our daughters to yourselves. So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. This will be your land. Dwell and trade in it. Acquire possessions for yourselves. Then Shechem said to her father, so Shechem was there with his daddy Hamor, and to the brothers, let me find favor in your eyes. I'm not such a bad guy. Certainly worked on John Calvin. He said, whatever you say to me, I will give. So I think it's probably a good place to stop because we're about halfway through this story. I think if we try to go to the end, we'll either not do it justice or we'll be here for another hour. So let's stop there. Let me ask your opinion at this point in the negotiation. What do you think God would want Jacob to do at this point? What is the most godly thing for Jacob to do at this point? Anybody want to take a stab?
Probably retribution.
I tend to agree with you, John. I believe, having studied quite a bit, the reasons to be violent in the Old Testament that are acceptable reasons. I think my take is, at this point, Jacob needed to step forward and say, number one, get Dinah here right now. Go get her and bring her here right now. And then after you deliver her, go get your swords and let's meet up on the hill. And I'm gonna take y'all out, because what you've done is a disgraceful thing in Israel, and I will not endure it. I will not endure what has already transpired. We will not mix with pagans, with polytheists, because we worship the one God. Now that's a hard thing for modern people. We want to think that the world is very peaceful and that only pacifism is acceptable. That's kind of my take. And now that is, again, red flag that, because that is an opinion. But I think from the eyes of the biblical author, that is the appropriate outcome. So let's wait till next week and let's see if Jacob steps forward. And think about if I'm right or not. Think about if you agree with that or disagree with that. And if you want to make a case next week, that would be a lot of fun. Any questions or comments about Jacob and his wives and this story? This is the spillover. We're still dealing with Jacob in this story. And I very much think that Jacob is at fault, and that pacifism he showed and the train wreck of his household when these were children, we're now seeing the spillover into this story. And we'll see the consequences next week. Any thoughts or comments? Questions? All right, let's say a prayer and be dismissed.